Well, thank you everyone for joining us here this morning or this afternoon, depending upon where you are in the world. My name is Chris Harley. I'm the Vice President of Sales at Data Basics, and the purpose of our conversation here this morning was to talk about time and expense management strategies in today's world. Was looking to only take probably about 20, 25 minutes of your time or so to talk about really what we're seeing here at Data Basics as far as some of the changes that are taking place due to the current environment out there. And I guess we don't need the elephant in the room, certainly looking at coronavirus and COVID-19 as far as the impact that it's having on organizations. The agenda I was going to take you through was just going to give you a little bit of background as far as what we're seeing from our customers and prospects out there as they look to adjust and adapt to the current environment out there. From there, what I will do is go through and show you again what companies are doing from a best practice perspective, and then I'll actually open up and show you a little bit about our application and how companies are leveraging it. As far as from a housekeeping perspective here, any questions that you guys may have during this conversation, please feel free to open up the GoToWebinar toolbar. You will see toward the bottom of it, it has the ability for you to put in questions, and at the end, I will certainly come back here and answer any questions there that you guys might have. And the only other piece out there is certainly looking at the list of different types of organizations and industries that are sitting in on this webinar. I'll try to, certainly tailor some of the pieces to some of the organizations we see, but certainly you may have some individual challenges out there. And again, please feel free to enter in any questions you have there on the question piece. And what we will certainly do is get back to you sometime later on today or this week and give you some answers as far as, just to any pieces that you guys may have there. For those of you that aren't familiar with Data Basics, we are a global provider of time and expense solutions. We've been providing these applications since the late 90s, really since the beginning of web-based solutions came out into the marketplace. We are headquartered in the greater Washington, D.C. area, in Reston, Virginia. And as we talk about these applications and these solutions, the general idea should be, from your perspective, is that regardless of what platform you may use, from a ERP or accounting side, a payroll platform, or even an HR side, we would certainly be looking to work and integrate with that. What's interesting today is the topic that we're talking about is something that it's safe to say has impacted every one of us that's on this conversation. Oftentimes you will be part of webinars out there where people talk about contingency planning for things like cyber threats and risk and other items out there. We're in the same boat really as everyone else as it relates to how we've looked to adapt and change to what's taken place here over the last few weeks. And so as someone who works in the management side of our organization, some of these items we'll talk about would certainly impact us. But then a lot of the stories and what we'll talk about would relate to more of what we're seeing there on the customer side and what's taking place from, the challenges that everyone's seeing out there from a time and expense perspective. Really as we look at what brought about this conversation is what we're seeing from the coronavirus. All of us started hearing about it in late February. In early March, it started to, as we look at for the U.S.-based companies, we started to see it more taking place here in the U.S. And according to Gartner, on Friday, March 13th, about 13% of the U.S. workforce had made the transition from the office into remote. By that following Monday, that number had more than doubled to 28%. And by the end of that week, it was up to 71% of employees had made the transition from working in offices to remote locations. Now, obviously, the impact out there was great, and we look at a number of different areas that were ultimately impacted from what we're seeing from the coronavirus. And the six I've got listed here are really kind of we kind of narrowed down the group that we looked to focus on, especially as we looked at how companies are trying to address these. So the first one, of course, was as we made the transition from employees working out of the office or at customer sites or at certain locations to moving into a home office or even coming back to the office first. And so one of the first challenges out there was looking at how do we give users access to a time and expense and leave platform, and what does that access look like? The next big one, of course, was as we had a transition here of employees home, or even moving employees off of client sites, it was what's going to take place as it relates to leave and PTO. Now, this continued to be impacted as we started to see employees who may be impacted, either affected by COVID-19 or maybe family members. And so we started to look at, how do we handle and what do we do with this very quick change here and from a leave and PTO? For those customers who work in the professional service area or federal contractors, or even people working for the state and local governments, we started to see the change of what takes place and how do we record hours as suddenly people are being moved off of projects or moving off project locations. What do we do as it relates to tracking time? What happens as it relates to those overall timesheets out there? And then we started looking at compliance out there. Suddenly we have employees that were at one point working from in the office. They're now working from home. It's possible, depending upon where you operate within the world or the U.S., or you maybe have employees who are working in New York City and now they've moved into New Jersey, and suddenly we have different payroll impacts based upon taxes and where those taxes should be withheld out there. So we saw some quick movements and changes as it relates to compliance. We certainly saw some new expense types taking place out there as it relates to employees making the transition home. And then depending upon organizations out there, the overall challenge as it relates just to the processing of time and expenses. If you had a system where you had to access it locally, you had to go into the office, or maybe we had spreadsheets, or we were still dealing with some sort of paper process out there where people were mailing and sending information to central locale. We saw that the overall processing challenges were greatly impacted. Now, what's interesting is kind of the overall time on response. And this is, even as we sit here today, and from my perspective, I look at us as being about 5 to 6 weeks into the big changes out here, as we saw that kind of that initial immediate, shock and awe of the overall process, which was, how do we go out and get employees access? Do they have the ability to track time? Do they have the ability to track expenses? Can we go in there and see what's taking place from a leave perspective? Once we give them access, how do we go out and track this? Do we create a new leave code? What are those leave codes? What are the overall impacts of what's taking place? And then as we make the transition to have employees move home, we have new expenses out there. We saw companies that were contacting us and asking us, what takes place? Do we give people per diems? Are you seeing that we should be paying for people's Wi-Fi? Do we need to go buy people monitors? Do we need to buy more ergonomic chairs out there? So we suddenly saw new expenses out there. So there was that immediate, what do we do? Now, what was interesting is that those immediate impacts and costs were taking place really in the mid part of March. Now, toward the end of March, we started to see some legislation coming in from the federal government out there. And so we saw the introduction of Family First Coronavirus Response Act and the CARES Act, at which point the Department of Labor started to put in place rules and regulations that were going to go into effect on April 1st. And so as we look at this timeline, we talked about kind of the immediate, I said kind of the shock and awe. And then what we saw was kind of that, okay, now we have adjustments out there. How do we handle and make adjustments for some of these items that are coming down from a legislation perspective, again, as it relates to our overall process out there? And then really we started to make this transition to kind of the new norm as employees got used to working remotely, as we started to put in place processes around leave, as we started to understand how we were going to manage projects out there, as we talked to our customers and saw what we could and couldn't bill for. So we basically have the new norm. But what is interesting today is what we are starting to see from our side is companies asking how we're going to prepare for the future. One of the most interesting one is related to leave. We've already seen a number of customers out there, and I'm sure you guys are starting to have internal discussions around, what are we going to do with leave? There's that question of, and the thing is, when we all, will we all go on vacation when we finally get back to work? And I think it's one of the big challenges out there with companies is, how are we going to handle this when people do go back to the office, if they go back to the office, as it relates to PTO? Because at this point, for the last 5 to 6 weeks, people have effectively been not taking, any sort of PTO out there as it relates to that. So with all these challenges, what we started to look at and what companies started to ask us here is, what are the key features that we need and what do we need to have in place to start managing change out there? And so as we look at all the, really taking a account of the last 6 weeks out there and now start looking at the future, these are really the 4 key areas that we've seen organizations looking to address as it relates to moving forward. The first part is trying to gain as much visibility as possible into their entire process. As organizations need to start making decisions, they need to have a good baseline for understanding of what takes place as it relates to leave, what's the impact of adding new expenses out there, and then, of course, being able to go out and forecast what takes place as it relates to budgets on time and projects in those areas out there. So the first area is certainly being able to have better visibility. The second area is the ability to have flexibility within the configuration as it relates to these time and expense solutions. One of our largest customers out there, we met with the director of their HR team in the first week of them sending employees home, and they made an adjustment to what they were doing from a leave perspective. This adjustment they made, they described to us, said that we basically got in the room and within about 30 minutes had made a decision for what was taking place. They described that those types of decisions in prior time periods may have taken weeks, months, if not years to come to a resolution on what those changes to their leave process and timesheet process would look like. Well, they made that change on a Tuesday, and then on Thursday came back with another change out there. And so what we're seeing from our customers is that not only are we making changes, but we're making a lot of changes and we're making quick changes. And so the second big area companies are looking for is to have a flexible solution in place so that we can go in here and make these changes to whatever they may take place. Now, again, once you are making changes, we're then looking at the ability to have adjustments out there. And so with any piece of software, it has the flexibility to make changes, but we also have to have the flexibility to make adjustments. And as we make those adjustments, what's important is that as we start looking at some of the compliances in place, that we have the ability to have audit trails around that so that we can see who made those changes so that historically someone can look back and look at that information. Along those same lines, as we look at adjustments and making changes out there, certainly as we look at federal legislation coming down, a lot of reporting is going to be required as it relates to funds that the federal government is putting out there. And so, again, we're going to want to be able to track and see that information. And then the last piece here is the ability to notify your workers once those changes have been made. There has to be a solution in place so that employees understand what the changes are, how it impacts them. And again, it can be easily notified out there. Looking at one of our larger pharmaceutical customers, last week, they made a rule where they were, as it relates to leave, where they were suddenly asking everyone to go in and basically take 6 days of leave in the next few weeks. Even though employees are working from home, they're looking for them to take leave. And so they wanted a way to push that information out to the employees. We were able to do that, or they were able to do that, I should say, with their software. But again, they want to be able to understand what's taking place, make those changes, and then communicate those changes. And so as we look at these key features, this is really what we're looking for as it relates to the overall best practices for leveraging technology. So obviously with the change where people were making the move to be remote, we've got to give folks web and mobile access. Now, one of the more interesting areas out there is that when we first made this had this impact, everyone immediately was thinking that mobile apps were really the solution for employees going remote. What's interesting is employees going remote, what we're seeing is fewer individuals using mobile apps, but rather using laptops out there to access the solution out there. So we still do give people mobile access, but really the web access has actually now jumped back up as people are no longer on the road and now sitting in front of their PCs within their homes. The other piece here is real-time reporting. You need visibility and you're going to make decisions, you've got to see information real time. As it related to the last few weeks of March with the coronavirus impact out there, as companies were looking at billing, they wanted to see what the impact was at that point in March instead of waiting for the end of the month to see what the overall impact's out there. The setup of new time, project, and expense codes has probably been one of the larger requests that we've seen here at Data Basics. On the expense reporting side, we've seen new expenses as companies are giving per diems out to employees, taking on some of the home office costs that employees may have out there. On the time perspective, certainly as we look at the Family First Coronavirus Response Act, companies are looking up for a way to track leave and to be able to track that through a new leave code. And then from a project perspective, companies where before maybe had employees working on site on a particular project, they want to be able to track that. Maybe that work is now being performed from home. Again, depending upon how that is being structured, it may have an overall impact on the time of the project piece. Continuing down that conversation as we look at best practices is, of course, the ability to adjust. I think that's probably the biggest thing that we've seen within our organization, as well as we start talking to customers out there, is that, quite frankly, we all wish the decisions we are being made today will be in place as we move forward. But I think as we look into the future, we recognize that, if this is the new norm, what it means is things may change fairly fluidly, and so we have to be able to go in there and to be able to make adjustments within the solution. And then integration. I mentioned earlier, one of the big challenges was companies that, the processing of time and expense wasn't an integrated platform into their overall HR, payroll, and accounting solution out there. So by having an integrated platform, it now means that if you're accessing the solution on the web, you can do all the processing from home or wherever you want to be accessing it. You don't have to come into the office to be able to collect this data and then have that information keyed over into your HR, your payroll system, or your accounting solution. All of that information should be able to flow seamlessly without you having to go to a physical location. And then really the big piece here, and this is more of a technology perspective, is having a test environment. A lot of our customers, prior to moving over to Data Basics, worked with vendors that they only had a single instance of the solution. If you have a single instance of your technology solution, it means that basically you're doing testing within your production environment out there. So it's critical that you have a second site out there so that as you make these changes and adjustments and you're looking to see what the impact is out there, you can run that through a test process and then go ahead and make that conversion over into the production environment when you're ready out there. And then really the last piece here is, of course, notifications and announcements. It sounds simple, but really being able to put all that information in front of your users, so they don't need to go look for it, they don't need to go find it in an email, but rather they can access it directly through the individual platform, is critical in making sure they understand the process. And then even going beyond notifications and announcements, to give the ability for the application to go in and to enforce those policies is also critical. So if I happen to enter in a time code or a pay code that really shouldn't be what I should be entering into the solution, to have the application stop you at that point of entry and say, wait a second, we do need to have you change this code, or if you're caring for a certain individual, you should be using this code. So the more you can push the proper information in front of the users, the cleaner this process is ultimately going to be out there. So with that, I know we've certainly been talking about, how we do this and some of the better practices out there. What I can do is kind of just open up and give you guys just a quick view here of what the solution would look like. In this case, you're looking here at the Data Basics platform out there. Now, this is what the individual user would see as they would come into our time and expense solution. Now, a couple things out there. Right off the bat, on the right side of the page, they're able to see the updates that are taking place for our internal PTO out there. So they can see whether we're going to implement a process where we ask them to, if for a use it or lose it type of process that they have to use it more quickly, or maybe we are suggesting other items out there. Or in this case, we have the ability to come in here and from a time perspective, if I'm a administrator, I have the ability to come in here and look at PTO as it relates to my overall users out there. So within a PTO platform that gives a calendar view, if I suddenly see that I have a whole bunch of employees that are going to be trying to take the same days off, I have the ability to go out there and to notify them and to ask them to not take those days off from that perspective. The other piece out here is, of course, is making sure that we are giving the users access to real-time information out there. And so, again, from a PTO perspective, as I come in here as an individual user, I can see what my starting PTO balance is. I can see what my accrual schedule is taking place. And then if the organization is going to make changes to what that accrual schedule is, I can go out there and see what those changes are. Now, on the timesheet perspective, I was mentioning earlier, one of the bigger challenges out there is some of the changes to, compliance as far as, where the employee is actually performing their work. And so in this case, as I open up and look at my time sheet, if the organization was to make an adjustment to a time code or pay code, we could easily see that in here. An organization could set up a pay code as a COVID-19 pay code, which would have a different impact on the overall process out there. We can also go in and access exactly where the work's being performed out there. So the flexibility and ability to make these changes very easily and to push it back out here into a web experience is certainly critical out there for the users. And then really the last piece out there is we talk about from the expense reporting platform. If you're going to create a process out there for employees where let's say nowadays you're going to reimburse them for certain information or for certain items that you didn't before. As they come into the expense platform, they're going to see information like the ability to come in here and to charge internet access. And you can go in there and tell them how much that amount is and those details around that perspective. And so you give them a platform here I think I lost you guys, but hopefully I'm back here. I apologize about that. So again, one of the challenges here is as we work from home, like everyone else out there, we sometimes experience audio issues out there. I apologize, but in any case, what I was looking to say here is that as it relates to the individual expense platform, the ability to create new expense types out there, to give them notifications out there, and then even if an organization is to implement something like a per diem, maybe we're going to say, or maybe it's not a per diem, but a flat fee for Wi-Fi charges or other items out there, you can set those up, basically turn them on, and then push it out to the individual user out there so that as the user comes in here, he or she doesn't need to guess what that information is as it relates to how much am I going to be reimbursed for Wi-Fi or some other expense out there. They can basically just select that expense. It would automatically drop in. and be able to pull that information right into the overall platform. And then really the last piece out there is the visibility. With any platform, you've got to be able to come in here and to see information and those expenses out there. And so what a tool like this will do is to give you the ability to come in here and to see that information. If you're looking to see details around PTO and what's taking place out there, or again, if we are creating a new leave management process, the ability to come in here and very quickly make adjustments to how that PTO takes place, and to, again, put that into a test environment and then ultimately roll that back out there to the users. So with that, I know very quick overall, we've taken about 25 minutes or so. And again, I apologize for the minute that I dropped off the phone there. But let me stop here and see if any questions as it relates to, really what we've talked about here today. And again, that is a picture of me and the marketing group. Decided, since I've been working from home now for about 5 weeks, I've now grown a beard that's quite large. But let me see what kind of questions you guys may have as far as, what we're seeing here from a time perspective, expense perspective. And again, if I don't get a chance to answer your question here today, or if you just want to send it separately, you'll see on the right side of the screen there is my, my phone number as well as my email address. If you've got any questions as it relates to that. So let me see here, and I've got time to take a few questions. First question relates to integration as it relates to payroll, HR systems with what we're talking about here from a time and expense perspective. So the answer is yes, we certainly would look to integrate our time and expense platform with whatever a customer has from a payroll, HR, or accounting perspective. Now, that could be a single solution on the accounting side and the payroll and HR side. It could be multiple solutions. So you could have someone that uses Oracle, and paychecks. And what we would typically do is to create an interface out there as it relates to both of those pieces. It'd be a bi-directional interface. And that interface would allow us to pick up information as it relates to projects, activities, employees, managers, and then, of course, on the payroll side, to be able to push that data over into the payroll perspective. Now, in our case, what I was talking about is the leave management platform as it relates to data basics. If you were using, again, an ADP or someone there on the payroll side, we would typically be pushing all that data back over to ADP, but all the accruals and those details would be done within data basics. Next question. Timeline for implementation. So we would typically, for someone looking to set up both our time and expense platform, we would typically, again, there's a number of variables that come into play, the complexity of the organization, the types of rules that you would have in place, but we would typically look at about, 6 to 8 weeks from beginning to end to implement. Now, it doesn't take that much time, but we look at elapsed time frames out there, for the organization to get together, for us to put together what the design's going to look like, the configuration, testing, and then rollout. We certainly have seen organizations looking to go quicker. The last few weeks, we've seen many organizations reach out to us to say, can we get something in place here in a few weeks? And the answer is certainly yes. We're happy to work with you as it relates to your time frame for the overall implementation out there. Next question. Pricing. So as it relates to our application, we price it on a per user basis. So it relates to the number of users out there. The more users you have within the solution, the more it's going to bring the pricing down. Please feel free to send us a note, and we'll be happy to provide some information out there. And I'll take one more question here. Adjustments to leave. So someone's asking a question here about the ability to adjust leave balances. So you certainly can go in and adjust leave balances here within the solution. You have the ability to pick that information up if you want to add leave balances, or if you want to adjust what someone's existing leave balance is. or even if people are sharing lead balances, you have the ability to certainly go out and do that there within the overall platform. And again, if you've got specific challenges or questions, we'd be happy to address those. So with that, just about 11:30 here Eastern time, I want to thank everyone for joining us here today. Again, the questions that we did not get a chance to answer, we will certainly go in and answer those and throw those back out to you. We did also record this webinar, so I'll be happy to share that with you. And again, if you have any questions about your internal process or just in general, please let us know and be happy to help. With that being said, thank you everyone for joining us today, and have a very safe week, and we'll hope to talk to you soon. Thank you.